Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's lecture about creativity and wellness. This week, you're going to take a look at what creativity consists of and how it impacts your overall health and well being. As always, the lecture is designed to add to the chapter in the textbook, so to be most successful on the quiz, be sure to study both this lecture as well as the book chapter. Ready to get started? Let's go. We have a very simple outline for today's talk. There are only a few key points that we want to emphasize here. One, that all people are creative creatures. Two, that all creativity we use gives us some very concrete benefits. And third, that understanding the process of creativity helps us be more intentional about being creative in our day to day lives. Hopefully, by the end of this lecture, you have a firm understanding that within you, there's a large source of creativity, and that being proactive can help you use that creativity to improve your overall level of happiness and quality of life. First, ask yourself, are you creative? Many of us, when we hear this question, automatically give some sort of negative response. Some of us might say, not really, or we might say, well, I'm a bad drawer, etc. Think about the power of language. Sometimes it's not what we say, but how we say it. By recognizing that how we phrase things can play an important role in how people interpret them, we can change this question from are you creative to how are you creative? That changes the question to recognize that you definitely have some sort of creativity within you, and it simply leaves us to describe it. Our first step is accepting that we have some creative juices flowing through us, and that we can take the next steps to understand what that looks like for each of us. And by understanding that we all have a sense of creativity, we can bust one of the greatest myths surrounding this domain of wellness, that being creative means you're some sort of artist. Now, of course, creativity does include the arts. However, being creative is much more than painting and sculpting. Think back to the lecture on cognitive wellness. Do you remember the 9 dot exercise? Solving that problem took a sense of creativity. There are only certain things that are required to be creative. First, we have to have some sort of familiarity with a topic in order to be able to be creative with it. For instance, in the top photo here, the artist who created this sculpture out of Legos had to know that Legos were stackable and that there were blocks that he could continue to stack in order to create this image. Likewise, to solve the 9 dot exercise, we had to have some previous knowledge about straight lines and a square of equally spaced dots. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to have any extensive knowledge, but we have to have some sort of familiarity for our creativity to start shining through. And it is that part of our prior experience or knowledge that gives all persons the capacity for creativity. For instance, our ancestors would have never made tools, including different types of arrows, spears, ropes, hammers, etc., if they were not aware of the benefits of their uses. A caveman might have originally found a sharpened stick or stone in nature, and from there found that they could cut or hunt with that. And that led them to create many different tools based off taking advantage of that original item's qualities. That same process occurs with problem solving. We can develop certain ways to approach problems that helps us solve current dilemmas, but also benefits us in the future. If we never stopped to think of new ways to do things, we would still be hiking instead of riding horses, driving on dirt paths instead of highways, and any new discovery made throughout history can then be deemed as a result of some sort of creativity, where somebody looked at the way things are currently done and improved upon it to make it even better. And it's that process that we benefit from. Working on puzzles or finding different solutions is great exercise for our brain. Think of our brain as a muscle, and we let our creativity guide our thinking. We find new perspectives, different opportunities, etc. All of these different things will strengthen that part of our brain muscle. It creates a sense of mental flexibility and adaptiveness that we can use in new and different areas. And with a greater sense of mental flexibility, we can also greatly reduce our stress. For instance, when you start working on a puzzle or a project, you may feel that there's only one specific answer. A creative and flexible brain will understand that there are multiple solutions that might exist. Knowing that can greatly reduce your stress. Being able to relax and look at the problem in greater detail gives us more in depth perspective that boosts our engagement with a topic or a problem and improves our focus in connecting our mind and our body. For example, think of cooking your favorite meal or recipe. Maybe while you're cooking, you realize you don't have one of the necessary ingredients. Someone with more understanding may know that based on the smells, tastes, or textures of all these different ingredients, that there's a substitute that they can use to finish the dish, or whether or not the dish can simply move on without replacing that item. If we weren't able to think outside the box, we might hit a roadblock and simply think the meal was ruined, or the task can't be solved. It's a prime example of how being creative helps us de-stress, relax, find new solutions, and engage with several of the different mind-body connections. Speaking of our cooking example, the book has a very nice list of some of the different art-based activities that an individual can participate in order to engage their creative side. I strongly encourage everyone to review this portion of the chapter as it explains each example in more length. However, we can quickly review them right now. First, let's talk about exercising creativity through recitation. This includes sharing stories about your day or others' experiences with another person. When we're able to talk to others about our stressors or our experiences, we can feel a boost in positive feelings through that self-expression. While tension and stress might start melting away, since we're able to actually share that with someone else, we can verbalize it and kind of get it off our shoulders or off our chest, we might say. It's a similar process that occurs when individuals choose to write, which is the second example. And when individuals do choose to write their thoughts or feelings, they can experience similar health benefits. Again, it's another opportunity to express yourself creatively. In recitation or writing, someone may choose to simply speak or write about events very concretely. However, others may draw comparisons, exaggerate some of those details, or even become more theatrical by acting out a memory or writing in a more dramatic fashion. The last example kind of ties in with some of the other aspects that you might see for perhaps people turning short stories into videos, like Pixar at the beginning of many of those movies, where different film creators are able to take a chance and kind of make a small movie that they're interested in. But either way, let's continue through our list here. The third example they give us is photography. Nowadays, it seems that everyone has a phone with a camera on it, and we can often spend times taking different photos, either with others or of things that we find in nature, etc. Really taking some time to enjoy those pictures gives you an ability to create or flex your creative side, or let that creative side flourish. Taking pictures from many different angles, for example, helps your brain understand that many angles exist in other aspects of life, which improves upon that mental flexibility we previously discussed. On from photography, they talk about creativity through movement, which can be as simple as moving closer towards or further from a person, place, or thing, but can also include other forms of expression like exercise or dancing. Perhaps one of the more familiar forms of creativity is humor. Telling jokes or riddles that make someone laugh is a form of creativity. Just being able to come up with a punchline on your own and being able to find ways that are surprising or twists and turns that we find humorous. That leads us to our next example, which is storytelling, and it's very similar to writing in the movie example I gave just a minute ago. However, with this, we're kind of looking at more of a longer timeline than a specific memory or interaction. For instance, what would your personal story look like if you wrote your story from birth until now? Can you come up with a plot and a general storyline? How would you tell that same story, but in a more positive way? How would you like the rest of your story to look? What things would you need to do today to ensure you fulfill that ideal storyline? All of these things are something that a professional counselor would work with the client regarding, and we would label it narrative therapy, and it leads to many positive outcomes. But the last example from the book here is music. It's another relatable example because many of us can think about how we prefer certain types of music to either kind of pump us up or to calm us down at different points in the day. Do certain songs seem to represent your mood at certain times? Being able to express ourselves through music is another strong example of how we can be more creative throughout our day. Although this is a strong list, it certainly isn't an all-inclusive list, and it really only focuses on art-based examples. For instance, our cooking example isn't listed, and I'm sure there are many other ideas we can come up with that would certainly be appropriate. Now, shifting more towards the what you can do to influence your creativity, let's take a look at the creative process. Here's an overview flowing from left to right. We'll take a few moments to review each of these in detail, but you can see here how the overall process works. First, we prepare ourselves for exploration, which is followed by immersing ourselves in a problem and incubating possible solutions. That leads to our aha moment in the illumination phase, and lastly, we share our results with others in the verification phase, seeking some feedback. Let's start by taking a close look at the preparation phase. In this stage of the creative process, we have to give ourselves permission to be creative. Remember in the lecture on cognitions when we mentioned that people typically approach new tasks using a form of black and white or right and wrong style of thinking. To move out of that stage, we have to accept that multiple answers might exist. Have you ever been faced with a problem that seemed too frustrating or too difficult to solve? Maybe you had to give yourself permission to try something to solve that problem using some strange or unconventional approach. That's what we're talking about here. People in the preparation stage have to forget about criticisms and give themselves permission to do something pretty out there. Examples of this can include individuals who say, okay, this might not work, but let me just try something really quick. Or I know this seems crazy, but what if, and they try something new. Overall, it's the first step in finding a creative solution. It's when we tell ourselves that we don't necessarily have to follow a bunch of rules, some of which might not even be written down, kind of like in the 9 dot exercise and breaking the lines outside of our box. But hopefully you're able to think of a time where you took this first step, and that should lead us well into our next step, or the immersion process. It's the immersion phase where we really get caught up in what we're doing. By this stage, you've already started thinking outside of the box and you're now putting those plans into action. Maybe you've made a couple of moves and you're starting to make adjustments based off of those. So you're 2 or 3 steps into this exercise or this activity, whatever you choose to be doing. Regardless, your attention is focused on the task at hand. This is where the individuals are more likely to experience a sense of flow that we've talked about before, but it's where they forget about other aspects of their day or even time and they just focus on exactly what's in front of them. This stage of creativity also engages you cognitively. This is when you go from trying out new ideas to actively exercising our skills of convergent and divergent thinking. So let's stop and take a minute to talk about each of those thinking styles before we move on to the next phase of the creativity process. Convergent thinking is linking many different points into new methods, or finding something that connects to all these different ideas. It could be grabbing new ingredients and bringing them together for some sort of like freestyle recipe in the kitchen, or finding common uses for objects to try and solve a problem with 2 or 3 things that normally don't go together. Take a minute to look at the example on the slide. If I said the words hair, income, and fish, what word or idea could you come up with that would link all 3 of these? If you'd like some time to think about it, pause the lecture here before we move on and reveal the solution on the next slide. One of the possible solutions that you could have come up with is the word net. You could easily have a hairnet, a net income, and a fishing net. The one concept is a common link between all 3 words that aren't typically related. Were you able to think of anything other than net? What were some of the solutions that you had? Here's some more of these puzzles. Take a look at each set of these words, and if you'd like, you can come up with some of the different commonalities between them. Again, feel free to pause the lecture here before we reveal some of the solutions that we have on the next slide. As promised, here are some of the solutions to those puzzles. Were they what you thought of? For instance, you can have an outhouse, a house or a home, as their synonyms, and a jailhouse. In the second set, you can have a black cat, black is a color, you can also have a black hole. And lastly, there's a basketball, a snowball, and a beach ball. Maybe you were even able to come up with something on your own, something completely unique that we wouldn't have thought of. The process that you use is how we work to think creatively. We can be pulling from many different ideas and tools that don't appear to fit at first, but end up working very well in the long run. Can you think of a time when you used two items that seemed unrelated to achieve a task? For now, let's move on and talk about divergent thinking and how it applies to your creative process. The opposite of convergent thinking is divergent thinking. This is where a single idea or concept can diverge into multiple different possibilities. You might start with a single thread, and what that branches into might be many different unrelated areas. A good example of this is using a tool or some idea that was meant for one intended purpose, but branching it off and using it for multiple different things that it wasn't originally intended for. One of the easiest ways I thought to illustrate examples of this are using those popular life hacks that take everyday items and it finds new uses for them. Here are a few of those life hacks here. You can see how they took items that weren't created for these purposes and found new uses for them. We will consider each of these creative solutions to a given issue or a problem. When we look at an object and we see only the single use that it was designed for, we might be experiencing a sense of functional fixedness. Functional fixedness is a form of lower level cognitive thinking where we believe there's only the one use for the object. It's a sign that you believe in a black and white or right or wrong way to use that item, etc. Can you think of a time where you took something and you used it for a purpose other than it was intended for? That would be an excellent example of creativity. So let's try applying these two thinking styles to this problem here. Some of you might be familiar with this problem, but we'll give it a shot anyway. Your task is to find a way to attach the candle to the wall so that when it's lit, no wax would drip onto the table, and you can only use the items provided. We'll move on and come back to the solution a little bit later. For now, just take a look at the items you have to work with, and feel free to pause the lecture here if you want to spend some time before we move on. While you think about our little puzzle here, let's talk about the third stage in the creative process, or incubation. This is a stage where individuals let different ideas or thoughts come together. Individuals in this stage may have been working to solve a problem for a while and just need to take a break. When individuals take a step back and let those ideas incubate, that doesn't mean that their mind is done processing the details. It's just not in our foreconscious mind. So think of a time when you're off doing something random, and all of a sudden you had a brilliant idea that you could have used to solve a problem or to do something differently. Those aha moments always seem to hit us at random times, and we have to stop and try and write them down in some way before we move on and we forget about it. Sometimes it can happen while we're exercising, working on something else, driving, or any other number of activities. One of the things we're doing now is letting some of your ideas with regards to the candle exercise incubate. If this were a real life scenario, we would want to take a longer break and let those ideas really cook together before we went on and shared the solution. But fair warning, the solution to the candle puzzle is on the next slide. If you're not quite ready to solve it, feel free to pause the lecture or to go back to the previous slide to re-review the content before moving on. So here you have it, the illumination stage. We finally had our aha moment. In the previous picture, the box was a container for the tax. However, in a form of divergent and convergent thinking, we can take these ideas that are usually strictly used for a certain purpose and bring them together to solve our dilemma. We can empty out that box and use a couple of those tacks to attach it to the wall. From there, we can place the candle inside the box and use the matches to light the candle. Then, the box will catch any of the wax while it dripped. Were you able to come up with this solution? Maybe you came up with something a little bit different. Either way, if you came up with a solution, you experienced a sense of illumination when you experienced that breakthrough or your aha moment. Now keep in mind that this is not the final stage in our process. Let's move on and see what we do from here. The final stage is verification. This is when we seek confirmation from others. You might have sought verification for your solution to the candle problem, checking to see if your solution was correct or not. The same could go for the 9 dot exercise or other assignments where you may have invested some work and needed to see if you were on the right track or not. Other popular examples could be infomercials or startup new companies. For people who are familiar with the ShamWow ads or maybe even the show Shark Tank, we could see people who had a moment of creativity where they found a new solution or product that they believed is a great idea. They didn't just stop with coming up with the idea, they took the next step and had to share it with investors or share it with the public through infomercials to see if it's something that would really be popular. In the past, have you come up with a creative solution for a task or created something new like a painting, sculpture, song, or story, etc., and asked somebody else for their opinion? Maybe you stopped and said, "Hey, what do you think of this?" You might ask someone, or you might wait to hear whether or not they get excited and accept your idea, or if they struggle to see the value in it like you have. Either way, seeking that outside verification is what we could be considered as the final stage in the creative process. Now, we certainly can't limit our sense of creativity to that simple process. Here's a list of the different types of creativity Dr. Shelley Carson has come up with. At the bottom of the slide, you can see a link to a test that would help you identify which form of creativity may fit you best. She also has a very popular book on creativity that is also available on her site. Keep in mind her acronym CREATE when we're thinking about the different forms of creativity. Quickly, her connect style of thinking is an active state of defocused attention. This is when we choose to blur our perceptions of things so that we can see other uses for them. For instance, if you saw a fork, you might only see an eating utensil, but if you access this connect style of creativity, you might just see that it's a piece of metal with prongs that could be used for many different tasks. I also think of the pattern images that we might have seen as children in some of those books, where if you defocus your eyes, a hidden image would appear. Now, next is the reasoning creativity. This cognitively rethinking of information in order to solve a problem. Take our fork example. Beyond simply seeing the fork as something that can be used for multiple different things, your reasoning creativity will help you actively think of what specific purposes it could serve for. The third is the envisioning type of creativity. Sometimes people see an item serving a new purpose versus actually thinking or verbalizing what they think the new purpose is. So some might not be able to explain their thoughts to you, but might just need to show you instead. So with our fork example, you might not be able to tell me what you think a new purpose is, but you can actually see yourself using this fork for different things. Moving along, the next is for those who access their absorb-oriented form of creativity. They're the individuals who sit back and collect information in a non-judgmental way. And while they do it, they're often looking for new connections amongst all this new information. The following type is the transform type of creativity, which represents individuals who are interested or motivated by taking their raw emotion and transforming it into a piece of work or art. And this might explain people who go and do things when they're frustrated or overly happy and try to create from that. Next is the evaluate style, and when you evaluate, you're using your ability to judge whether or not ideas or attempts at solving certain issues were worthwhile and should be continued, or you should be kind of given up and other areas pursued. Next is the stream style, which is very similar to the concept of flow and that we've discussed before. Individuals here are just operating without much thought or effort. They're just able to go and be in the moment. But overall, her model of creativity is very popular. I went over this very quickly, so if you want to get more information, visit her website. You can also just pause the lecture here and take your time looking over some of the info that I glanced over. Now, we certainly can't limit our sense of creativity to that simple process. Here's a list of the different types of creativity Dr. Shelley Carson has come up with. At the bottom of the slide, you can see a link to a test that would help you identify which form of creativity may fit you best. She also has a very popular book on creativity that is also available on her site. Keep in mind her acronym CREATE when we're thinking about the different forms of creativity. Quickly, her connect style of thinking is an active state of defocused attention. This is when we choose to blur our perceptions of things so that we can see other uses for them. For instance, if you saw a fork, you might only see an eating utensil, but if you access this connect style of creativity, you might just see that it's a piece of metal with prongs that can be used for many different tasks. I also think of the pattern images that we might have seen as children in some of those books, where if you defocused your eyes, a hidden image would appear. Now, next is the reasoning creativity. This cognitively rethinking of information in order to solve a problem. Take our fork example. Beyond simply seeing the fork as something that can be used for multiple different things, your reasoning creativity will help you actively think of what specific purposes it could serve for. The third is the envisioning type of creativity. Sometimes people see an item serving a new purpose versus actually thinking or verbalizing what they think the new purpose is. So some might not be able to explain their thoughts to you, but might just need to show you instead. So with our fork example, you might not be able to tell me what you think a new purpose is, but you can actually see yourself using this fork for different things. Moving along, the next is for those who access their absorb-oriented form of creativity. They're the individuals who sit back and collect information in a non-judgmental way. And while they do it, they're often looking for new connections amongst all this new information. The following type is the transform type of creativity, which represents individuals who are interested or motivated by taking their raw emotion and transforming it into a piece of work or art. And this might explain people who go and do things when they're frustrated or overly happy and try to create from that. Next is the evaluate style, and when you evaluate, you're using your ability to judge whether or not ideas or attempts at solving certain issues were worthwhile and should be continued, or you should be kind of given up and other areas pursued. Next is the stream style, which is very similar to the concept of flow and that we've discussed before. Individuals here are just operating without much thought or effort. They're just able to go and be in the moment. But overall, her model of creativity is very popular. I went over this very quickly, so if you want to get more information, visit her website. You can also just pause the lecture here and take your time looking over some of the info that I glanced over. So let's tie together these points. As much as it's important to accept who you are in order to set goals or to find meaning and purpose, you also have to give yourself that same level of acceptance or permission to be creative. You have to be at ease with the fact that you'll be challenging well-accepted rules of functioning, and it may or may not result in positive outcomes. It's also important to understand how you typically express your creativity and when it's appropriate. For instance, many individuals may have a very strong source of creativity in playing a musical instrument, but playing it in a room full of people studying quietly might not be the best option. On the other hand, there are opportunities to be creative in any situation, and each context may condone different types of creativity. We have to be willing to recognize where certain types of creativity are or are not welcome. Given that the first step is being accepting and open, the second is being aware of opportunities. The next is the third, and that's being aware that what usually gets in your way of being creative. Typically, it could be some sort of self-judgment, whether you're judging yourself or feel like you're being judged by someone else. But either way, keep in mind what's usually blocking you from accessing some sort of creative side. And from there, I would recommend simply practicing some of the things we talked about. See what you enjoy and what doesn't seem to fit for you. No matter what your outcomes are, I hope you take a moment to find the value in your creative endeavors. And as always, feel free to contact us with questions. Otherwise, best of luck on your quiz.